Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the January 2026 edition of Framing the Future, an opportunity for us to talk about topics that we believe will help frame the future of forestry here in Maryland. The program is being recorded and will be made available on our website probably within the coming week. We're very pleased to have you. My name is Gary Allen. I'm the president of the Maryland Forestry Foundation, and we have our excellent program today, and we'll be talking a little bit more about some of our future programs before this conversation is over. It's my pleasure to introduce Megan Carr, our moderator for the series, and a former Mel Fellow for the foundation. Megan?
All right, thank you, Gary, and we get to introduce each other today, which is fun. Before we do that, though, I'll just make a couple of brief housekeeping notes for those of you in our audience. As Gary mentioned, you can view previous entries in our webinar series over at marylandforestryfoundation.org. You can also sign up for our mailing list to learn about future topics and see all the other great work going on at the foundation over at the website. During today's discussion, please do enter your questions in the Q&A box found at the bottom of your Zoom window for our speakers to answer at the end of today's session. And with that, we'll keep it short and sweet and kick it back over to Gary. Gary Allen has a long career in service to the people and environment of Maryland. He's the author of 2 books, various policy papers, and numerous magazine and newspaper articles. He's served as the mayor and council member for the city of Bowie and has been selected to serve on and lead a number of groups promoting and recommending policy initiatives on land use, forestry, education, and conservation efforts. Since 2009, he has served as president of the Maryland Forestry Foundation, where he has been working tirelessly to promote healthy forests and support the next generation of forestry and environmental professionals in the state of Maryland. And now we turn it back to Gary to talk about some of that work.
Thank you very much, Megan. Really appreciate that introduction. Gives you an overview of my involvement. Friends, I'm really excited to be able to kick off 2026 by talking a little bit about what the priorities for the foundation are in the coming year and to outline a little bit about our planning for that period of time. Those of you who followed the foundation over the years, this is now the 5th year of this webinar series, know that we have priorities in policy, program, project, and other kinds of specific actions that we're involved in. Late 2025 and now early 26 promises to be some of the most challenging and yet unique opportunities we've ever had for the foundation. Specifically, I want to talk about the fact, starting out, that this is an election year. And so, in the policy thing, we'll be talking about what we're going to be talking about in the legislature in the coming year. Our priority in the legislature this year is basically 2 pieces of legislation out of the more than 60 pieces of environmental legislation that we expect to be presented in this particular legislature that have potential impact on climate, the environment, and forestry. The one that we'll be most concerned about, the one that we'll be talking about the most, is the Forest Stewardship Act. Our lead sponsor is Delegate Dylan Beyer. We're still trying to nail down the sponsorship for cross filing in the Senate. This act is over 2 years in gestation. We've worked with over a dozen stakeholders in putting together the context of this legislation, and Delegate Beyer is recently appointed to the House of Representatives. He fills the position formerly held by new Congressman Sarah Elfrich, and his position at the Department of Natural Resources brings excellent insight into the background for this legislation. This program, this piece of legislation is all about incentivizing ecological services of forest lands. It has some unique things. So it declares these ecological services of forest lands for the first time in state law as public benefits. Now, all of you are familiar with the variety of presentations you probably have seen over the years on forestry, and all of them talk about the benefits of trees, and they highlight those. Now we're going to talk about those benefits as public benefits and acknowledge them as public, codify those benefits, and look for ways in this legislation we might declare them of importance, how we might look to them as strengths to mitigate climate challenges, promote biodiversity, improve water quality, provide flood mitigation, and other public benefits and look at ways to incentivize these things. So the strengths of the bill that is being introduced in the next 2 weeks in the legislature, I'll mention 8 of them real quick. First, it codifies these public benefits. It puts them in law and says these kinds of things that forest landowners do. And remember, over 70% of all forest cover in Maryland is owned by private individuals. So providing incentives for the retention of that land as forest cover is extremely important to the future. We want to provide incentives to do that for the conservation, management, and restoration of these lands. And so we're going to encourage forest landowners to develop a new type of forest conservation plan to do that, one which highlights and focuses on ecological services of their land. And we want to provide some financial incentives for the retention of that land, provided the landowner, in the context of a focused plan on the preservation, protection of those services on their property, signs a 20-year commitment. That's a generational commitment by the landowner to protect that property and its ecological service benefits for the public for the next generation. To do that, we'll establish a new fund to do that. And that will be based upon an initial appropriation we're asking the legislature to make, and then based upon an ecological services impact fee that can be assessed on activities that generate large ecological service adverse impacts, such as the new data centers. By the way, there are more than 40 of them in Maryland today, and the utility infrastructure to serve them. Those are just examples of things that might generate fees to feed it. It defines how those payments might be administered by establishing a 3-year pilot program to be designed by the Department of Natural Resources. And then ultimately, it provides for a way of continuing those payments to the landowner based on the available funds in the fund so established through 2050. In other words, we're going to give a 25-year commitment to this so that we can do the pilot and then have 20 years beyond that at least, and phase down to look about whether or not the program ought to be renewed. So clear through 2050. It's a unique program, probably one of the most innovative ideas for forest conservation, management, protection, and the expansion of the services they provide in the last 20 plus years. As a matter of fact, based on our experience with the legislature, only the Forest Conservation Act itself probably was of greater consequence ultimately if adopted as a piece of ongoing state policy. It's unique in that sense and really sets a precedent nationally for this kind of work. In addition to that priority in legislation, our priority program in the coming year is reframing how forest district conservancy boards work in Maryland. Forest boards were established in 1943, and a local forest conservancy district was a county. The department is redefining what a district is in 2026 so that it creates 4 statewide districts, and the counties then become part of those regional districts. That means that a local board is no longer going to be a district. It will simply be a chapter of the foundation. That will, we're working on the resources and documentation to help define how this new affiliative relationship between the foundation and the agency and the local boards will work in the coming year. It's our determination that the boards will remain independent from the foundation in all of their operations, planning, and fundraising. But they will have certain parameters they'll have to work within for their financial management so that they can come under the umbrella of the foundation's 501c3 nonprofit status. And that gives us a way and the state a way of tracking the finances of the local chapters in the future and reporting those and providing tax benefits to those that contribute to their work at the local level. This is a unique way to help free up and expand the opportunities for engagement and partnerships at the local level. But at the same time, because it's different from the past, it means that we'll go through some transition periods where we have a new handbook for these people. We have a chapter agreement for for the folks. We have a new set of bylaws in process for each board, and ultimately, we'll do a lot of new activities for volunteer recruitment at the local level for each of the boards. But all told, again, we feel it's a new opportunity for even greater service to private forest landowners and the forest stakeholders in every county in Maryland. 2026 also brings to an end the pilot phase for the Urban Forestry Careers Camp. This program is cloned after the Natural Resources Careers Camp that's been so successful with local boards and high school students dating back to the early 1970s. We felt that program just ought to be expanded with a unique focus on urban forestry, where the majority of our people live, both here and across the nation. So it's an example for the rest of the country. It's the first urban forestry program exclusively located on a college campus, in this case, obviously, the University of Maryland. Registration's now open. We have positions for up to 30 high school students. Matriculating high school students going into college, along with seniors, juniors, and sophomores, are available for this. We have new partners with the District of Columbia, with Casey Trees, with the Sustainable Maryland program. And the unique thing about this urban forestry program, it's not limited just to Maryland students. So, in the previous 2 years of the pilot, which we feel have been most successful, not only the kids loved it and the faculty supported it, we've had students from outside the area enrolled in it. It's proved to be very attractive and excellent program. So we're looking to see this third year program to be as successful as the first year, and then transitioning that to a broader spectrum of future support in the year ahead, beyond the July program in 2026. Our largest program, just to remind you, is one that works directly with private forest landowners. We've planted to date more than 750,000 trees under this program. It's supported by the Chesapeake and Coastal Bays Trust. This is our largest kind of program that supports the work of the foundation. In the coming year, we expect and plan to plant 178,000 trees on 72 sites in 13 counties. I'm reading it right off the thing simply to remind you this is a very significant tree planting program, and it is together with the foundation's commitment to provide 1 million trees plus toward the 5 million tree program goal of the 5 million tree program passed in 2023. So we're supporting that program. We're an active part of that work with the Chesapeake and Coastal Bays Trust. And if you know of landowners who might be interested in this kind of turnkey program, it provides not only for the planting of trees on private property, it provides for their maintenance for the first 3 years of that work. The commitment the landowner has to make is to retain that land as forests in order to receive these benefits and other benefits that are provided locally through the local tax program for a period of at least 15 years under the 5 million tree program. Notice that is the longest voluntary commitment a landowner can make other than simply a permanent easement currently under this work. But the Forest Stewardship Act asks for an even longer commitment by landowners if that were to be passed of 20 years in exchange for the ongoing financial commitments authorized under that proposed legislation. Our biggest challenge in 2026 is how we're going to bring together these and all the other commitments we've made over the years. And so we're simply reorganizing ourselves to do that. In late 2025, we actually reorganized our work and hold on a minute, I just got a new kitty cat here and she just decided to join me a minute. Um, Hold on, he's deciding to do more things that I wanted him to do right now. There we go. And so we actually reorganized our staff. We had not previously had regular staff before, but for the first time in October, we actually hired new regular salaried staff for the first time. And so we have a new finance officer. We have a new field officer for working with the forestry boards, and the finance officer will help with the finances that I mentioned earlier that are a part of bringing them under the 501(c)(3) umbrella. And you can see in this slide that the foundation's focused in five different major areas: our educational programs, the Mel Fellows, NRCC, the urban program, our webinars, scholarships, the new Institute of Forestry Science we'll be talking about more in 2026, our field operations and landowner outreach, our forestry board operations with the new forestry board chapters, and the various standing committees that deal with forestry that we're charged with helping to provide fiscal and staff support for the Department of Natural Resources as an affiliated foundation of the department, a kind of brand new designation that emerged out of legislation passed last year by the legislature. And I assume that I can make this work again. Bringing all these priorities together, you can check our website is going to be our challenge in 2026, finding the resources to sustain them in the physical constrained times within which we find ourselves. And that also affects the legislation priorities. As I mentioned earlier, it requires an initial appropriation. And in light of the fiscal constraints, uh, we believe this is an important discussion to have in the legislature, but I'm under no false delusions that it's going to pass in the first year. As a matter of fact, because of its price tag and the expected fiscal note that will accompany it, I suspect that the legislation passage will be moot. But it is the kind of thing providing for the codification of ecological service benefits and incentives to preserve and protect them on the state's land cover base, as at least 40% of the state's land cover. These kinds of challenges are the kind of things that a state like Maryland ought to be talking about in our judgment. They're the kind of things and discussion that we want to have with our policy leaders here in the state of Maryland. In that context, we look forward to working with you, particularly through this webinar series. It's been our pleasure to help provide this series going on now. As I said, this is our fifth year. And I want to remind all of you that while this program is a kind of an overview of what our priorities are and the new Bay Agreement, which we're going to introduce here in just a few moments, next month, many of you have asked questions about what's legal for nonprofits and local volunteers who are part of those nonprofits to actually do as advocates in the legislature. Obviously, a citizen always has the right to contact their legislature, but many of you, in the context of your organizational structure, wonder what kind of limits you have. So, we have asked a group that is familiar with these rules nationally and how they affect all 501c3 and other types of groups to draw those distinctions more clearly for you and tell you what's up. So in February, on the third Thursday in February, I believe it's February the 15th, you'll want to join our webinar to talk about advocacy and helping to achieve a better understanding of what's permitted for you and your organization under the umbrella of your particular tax status. In March, just looking ahead at the quarter, we're going to be updating the rollout of the Forest Conservation Act rules for local governments because how we protect, preserve, and enhance forest cover is the primary mission of the foundation. So we've been working closely with the Department of Natural Resources and the rollout of the new rules and regulations at the local level. And we'll be doing an update before the new handbook is published later this spring on the Forest Conservation Act. We've got plenty of wonderful opportunities that lie yet ahead in the coming year on forest health, on the relationship of forest to human health, and of course, updates with our own programs, with the Mel Fellows programs and the urban forestry and other camp experiences that folks are going throughout the state. We're excited about the year ahead. We see these challenges as unique opportunities. And so I want to ask you to again put on your calendar each third Thursday to join us for Framing the Future, where we'll have a chance to expand your understanding and our information base about all of the opportunities we see and challenges that we consider that will frame the future of forestry in Maryland. Megan, I hope that's helpful. Let me turn back to you now so that you can introduce our next speaker.
Excellent. Thank you, Gary. Appreciate the overview. And yes, we do have another speaker for everyone today. We're very excited to be joined by Katie Brownson, who is the U.S. Forest Service liaison to the Chesapeake Bay program and coordinates the program's forestry work group. In this capacity, Katie facilitates partnership to advance forest restoration and conservation in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. I'm going to go ahead and get my screen share going here. Um, there we go.
Fantastic.
Confirm, are you seeing it in the correct view?
We're working. It's working.
Yep,
It's
looks great.
working. Okay. Great. Yeah, so I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the new watershed agreement with a particular focus on kind of what it means for watershed forestry in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And I'm also going to use this opportunity to shamelessly plug a couple of new resources that we put out later last year. So as you all are probably aware here, the Bay program has really long recognized the important role of forests in providing clean water to the Chesapeake Bay, as well as all the other local waterways that feed into it, and providing numerous other benefits for wildlife, fish, and communities. And working forests are certainly an important piece of that puzzle. But up until very recently, the program was operating under a 2014 watershed agreement that really focused in on riparian areas and forests and tree canopy within communities. So these were our two goals in the 2014 Chesapeake Bay watershed agreement. And honestly, we did tend to focus a lot on tree planting, but conservation was at least implicit in both of these goals, and we needed to look at, you know, not only the gains that we were achieving through planting, but also the losses that we're able to pick up across the landscape. Particularly in recent years, as we've had access to a really fantastic new high resolution land use land cover data set that's enabled us to get a really good idea of actually how much forest we are losing within riparian areas, within communities, and within the watershed more broadly. So to give a snapshot of where we landed with these two outcomes in particular, for riparian forest buffers, we did build a lot of momentum through planting, even though we did fall well short of our 900 mile per year target. Um, but looking at the land use data, we did actually get pretty close to that 70% goal. We had a goal to have 70% of riparian areas throughout the watershed be forested as part of that outcome language. We got really close, but unfortunately, the data is showing us that we're moving in the wrong direction. So we lost over 40,000 acres of riparian forest across the full land use change monitoring period, which ran from 2013 or 14 to 21 to 22. For community tree canopy, again, if we only look at planting, it looks pretty good. We achieved really record amounts of tree planting within communities, far exceeding that 2,400 acre goal, but it was a net gain goal. So again, when we look at that land use change data, we can see that the tree canopy losses within that community footprint are far outpacing gains. So we had a net loss of nearly 29,000 acres within communities alone. So, many outcomes in the 2014 Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement, including that tree canopy outcome, set a target date of 2025. So, in the lead up to 2025, the partnership recognized that we were going to need, to consider our path forward and what's going to come next. There was a really long process, literally hundreds of hours of meetings to figure out what our path forward was going to be. But the short story is that we decided to amend the 2014 watershed agreement rather than develop an entirely new agreement, and that we should be simplifying and streamlining the agreement and the partnership. The partnership also decided that there was a need to elevate conservation as a key pillar of the program, I think in large part to that high resolution land use land cover data set that really gave us a good idea of just how much we were losing. We can do a great job with restoration, but if we're not dealing with the conservation side, we're never going to meet our kind of long-term restoration goals for the watershed. So the previous tagline for the program was science, restoration, and partnership, and we kind of agreed to elevate conservation to that level. So we're now looking at science, restoration, conservation, and partnership. So the 2014 watershed agreement had 10 goals, which you can see on the right side of this diagram here. They're listed. But as part of the effort to streamline and also to kind of reduce the number of silos that we were working in to kind of be more integrated and holistic, the watershed agreement went from 10 goals down to 4 goals, which is what you see on the left there. On the outcome side, which is where we had our forest buffer outcome and our tree canopy outcome, we went down to 21 outcomes from over 30. And so there was some streamlining in terms of the overall agreement and how it's organized, but we're going to see that really the scope of work hasn't shrunk. I think it's gone in the opposite direction, at least for forestry, despite the, could be perceived streamlining in the agreement itself. So we look at how forests are integrated into this revised Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement. They really do appear in multiple places. So the vision specifically calls out the importance of forest health and productivity. The principles highlight working lands and economically viable forests and forest landowners. The forests are referenced in the preamble to the Healthy Landscapes goal language as kind of being really foundational to healthy landscapes. And then we do have this healthy forests and trees outcome that I'm going to be covering in more detail. But forests and trees also appear under the protected lands outcome and under land use planning and decision support outcome. So they're really woven in multiple places in the watershed agreement, which I think just speaks to the fact that there's broad recognition that, forests are really still critical to the overall watershed restoration effort. So zooming in a little on our new healthy landscapes goal, which is where our forest outcome is living. The new healthy landscapes goal is to conserve, protect, restore, and enhance landscapes of ecological, economic, recreational, and cultural value to improve water quality, provide habitat for wildlife, and increase resilience. So it's a pretty big, lofty goal. So this is where I really want to focus in and spend some time. As part of this effort to streamline, as I mentioned, our two previous outcomes for forest buffers and tree canopy got combined into one outcome, but it is a much broader and more holistic outcome. So the outcome calls for conserving, managing, and restoring forest and tree cover throughout the entire watershed. So we're no longer restricted to just kind of focusing in on riparian areas and communities. And so under the structure of this new agreement, forest buffers and tree canopy are now what we're calling targets under this broader outcome. So they're still maintained in the agreement, but they're just kind of moved down an organizational level. So each of our three targets that are under this healthy forests and trees outcome is organized in a somewhat similar way. They all set an intention for conservation. They set a long-term stretch goal, while also setting what we think is a more achievable goal for 2040, which is the time frame for the watershed agreement more broadly. And there are a few other differences I wanted to highlight with the previous agreement. So for the tree canopy outcome, we're for the first time setting an explicit cumulative planting goal of 45,000 acres total from 2014. So before, the planting goal was kind of implicit in that net gain goal, but it was kind of complicated to communicate the gains and the losses. So we wanted to really have a focus on planting because that is what a lot of our partners end up focusing on. We also called out an explicit focus on maintenance, which is really important, as you all know. For the forest buffer target, the planting goal shifted to an acreage goal. So it used to be 900 miles per year. Now we're at 7,500 acres per year. And this was requested by our partners since acreage is what the Bay program is actually tracking through our annual progress reporting. So it's just a little bit easier to line up with the information that we have available without having to kind of do some estimates based on average buffer widths. Just for context, the old 900 mile per year goal came out at about 10,900 acres per year with a 100-foot average buffer width, which is what we were generally seeing across the watershed. So the new goal is a decrease compared with that previous goal, but when we look at those numbers, like we never actually reached that 900 mile per year goal over the history of the 2014 watershed agreement, even with a really big influx of federal and state funding in recent years. So we thought it was prudent to reduce it to something more attainable, but I do want to highlight that this is still an extremely ambitious planting goal. I think we've only achieved it once or twice, maybe, since 2014. So we're not taking our foot off the pedal. We're just kind of bringing ourselves more into the realm of reality with something that we have achieved before, but it's still really ambitious. And for forest buffers, we also increased our long-term goal to 75% riparian forest cover. So we had previously established that 70% goal, but we had always intended it to be more of a floor than a ceiling. The language read like at least 70%. But we found that floors really don't make the best goals. They're not very inspirational. And so we looked at the Chesapeake Healthy Watersheds Assessment and, which pulls in macroinvertebrate monitoring throughout the watershed and kind of rates streams based on their relative health. And on average, we determined that, 75% is what is really needed to support good stream health in the watershed. So we thought that would be a good kind of more of a ceiling sort of target that we want to stretch for over the long term. But again, we kind of walk that down to, what we think is potentially achievable through a combination of both planting and reducing the rate of riparian forest loss that we're seeing. So the last piece here, forest conservation. So this is brand new. This is a new target. And we're really thinking about forest conservation really holistically. So in addition to, reducing the rate of forest loss that we're seeing across the watershed, we're also going to be tracking permanent protection of forested lands under this goal, and then looking at forest restoration across the watershed to track net gains. And just wanted to provide a little bit more context here on kind of our thinking behind, what we're trying to achieve with this forest conservation goal. I think we're really excited about this opportunity to elevate forest conservation for the partnership and make that connection stronger. Healthy forests are clean water. We don't just need to be planting, which we do need to do, but we also need to be thinking about the health of our existing forests as well. And we need to pay more attention to all of our upland forests as well that, are providing us tremendous benefits for water quality, habitat, communities, other things. So that was honestly kind of a blind spot for the program before. And when we're thinking about forest conservation, the program did have a protected lands target for forested lands before, but we can't just think about permanent protection of lands. Forest conservation also needs to include being good stewards of the forest. And, we see this as an opportunity to better engage with the forest management community, build awareness of forest management practices and their benefits. And then, as the forestry work group at the Bay program, I think a lot of the value we provide is kind of that regional coordination around forest management to help maximize our impact and, providing a community of practice and a place for people to kind of come together and talk about what's working. So before I wrap up, I did want to share a couple of tools that were really designed to support our partners, local decision makers, practitioners, and others. So they can leverage that high resolution land use land cover data set I mentioned earlier to better understand their forest and tree canopy, how they're changing, where there might be opportunities to advance forest conservation and restoration, the places you work. And, we think all of this is really in support of implementing this revised watershed agreement. So this first tool I wanted to just share here is the State of Chesapeake Forest Story Map. You should be able to access it via this QR code, and we can throw a link in the chat also. And I just want to give big kudos to USGS here at the Bay program, especially Michelle Kotowski, Dave Strong, Sarah McDonald, and others for all their support with processing all the data for this story map and developing the web apps that we've included here. So the original story map we put out was published in 2023 with the first round of high resolution data, high resolution change data that we had. And it was designed to build on this 2006 State of Chesapeake Forest report that I imagine some of you are familiar with. It was really more of a book and provided a really comprehensive look at the history of forests and the watershed and their importance and, the best data they had at the time on forest extent, composition, and health. But, needless to say, our understanding has advanced pretty significantly since then. And so we developed this story map in 2023, and then we just updated it again in 2025 with the latest round of data, which is from 2021 and 2022. So some highlights that might be of interest for you all. We have new estimates on the benefits of tree cover in the watershed broken down at the watershed, state, county, municipality. I think we maybe even have incorporated. I can't remember all the breakdowns. So we have a ton of data on ecosystem service benefits trees are providing. We have summarized data on forest and tree canopy change across the watershed. We have a whole series of interactive maps, case studies, and then links to these tree cover fact sheets. So looking at some of the just big picture findings that we present, as of 21, 22, we found that trees are covering 62% of the watershed, and the majority of those acres are in forest. And, watershed wide, the trees are providing over $15.3 billion in benefits annually, just from air pollution removal, reduced stormwater runoff, and carbon sequestration, which is kind of a mind-boggling number to think about. Um, the story map provides these kind of downloadable infographics on the amount and type of tree cover found in each state, like the infographic you see on the left, as well as the ecosystem service benefits that are being provided by that tree cover, like the infographic on the right. And those are all based on estimates from iTree Landscape. And as I mentioned, we have a data file with the ecosystem service data broken down in other ways as well. And then we also have data on what we call forested extent, which includes recently harvested and early successional forests that we believe are naturally regenerating and have similar infographics for forested extent as well. Moving into the change data, looking across the watershed, we found a net loss of over 104,000 acres of tree cover to development alone. And so this, just to clarify, this does not capture land cover transitions that are a result of forest management. We're able to isolate those out of the land use change data. And when we look at the ecosystem service data from iTree, this tree cover loss is resulting in the reduction of over $331 million in ecosystem service benefits annually. So it is having really big implications. So we also have a series of kind of county level viewers where you can kind of click around and see how different counties are showing up, both in terms of tree cover, forest extent, and change. So this one is for tree cover change. And the web app allows you to visualize the relative amount of tree canopy change to development at the county and municipal scale. You can compare the relative amount of change with other counties in your state and the watershed. And then it houses links to these tree canopy fact sheets. You can see in the red circle there, there's a link to this fact sheet. The same thing happens if you select a municipality. So you can get kind of a deeper dive into how things are changing at a more local level. Those fact sheets are also available directly on the Chesapeake Tree Canopy Network website, which you can see here. And this is kind of what those two-page tree canopy fact sheets look like. The Chesapeake Conservancy really led the development of these fact sheets, but they were a collaborative effort of all the partners you can see listed on the bottom of the fact sheets there, including University of Vermont, USGS, and the Forest Service. We released one set of these fact sheets in 2023 based on 2017-18 data. And they were really well received, but before long we had new data, and so we just updated these and put out new fact sheets in 2025, and then added the municipal scale fact sheets for every incorporated municipality in the watershed, which is something we heard from partners would be really useful. So all of those are available to download in one of those two ways that I shared. And then this is the link again to the Tree Canopy Network webpage, and then just showing that we also have a more detailed data guide if you want to dig into some of the details a little bit more. So hopefully those resources will be useful to you, and wanted to make sure you were aware that they're out there, and seems like maybe there might even be a nexus with that Forest Stewardship Act work that you're doing, Gary, in terms of codifying kind of the environmental benefits of trees. We actually have kind of up-to-date quantifications of what those benefits are, at least for a subset of the ecosystem service benefits that trees are providing. So that is all I had to share today. I have my email address here if anyone wants to reach out if you have questions, but I think we do have a little time for questions and discussion now as well.
We do. We have the next 15 minutes for questions and discussion with our audience members. At this time, we don't have any questions pending, but I will remind folks to please enter their questions into the Q&A function. You can find that at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And while we wait for questions to come in, this is always my opportunity to like sneak in my own questions before the flood begins. So moderator's privilege. But I'm curious if you have thoughts or ideas. So I'm coming from a municipal forestry background, and we are, of course, very concerned with things like beech leaf disease as a looming contributor to canopy loss. Within all of the programs that you were able to give us a high level view on, are you aware of good resources that might be available for land managers who are looking at ways to mitigate some of these upcoming impacts?
Yeah, so I mean, I know through our Forest Health Protection program, there are some resources and state agencies. I believe through Maryland, it's through MDA. They run their Forest Health shop. I don't have anything like offhand, but I could definitely follow up with my forest health colleagues if that would be helpful. But I guess I would say like at the Bay program, I feel like this like forest health and tree canopy nexus is one that we're like really interested in digging into a lot more because honestly, it's been kind of a blind spot for the program historically, but we know that it can be a really big issue. And if we want to keep forests on the landscape, we need to be thinking about forest health issues as well. So we are actually convening a workshop next month to talk about forest health and kind of strategies for addressing it in the context of the Bay program and bringing forward some. We're hoping it's going to kind of generate some recommendations that will guide our forestry work group at the Bay program to thinking about what our role can be in helping to support some of those efforts. So not super specific, but it is an area that we are interested in delving more into the future.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for that. Uh, Gary, I know whenever you come off camera, it's usually because you've got a good idea brewing, so I'll let you chime in.
Well, Catherine, I'd like to ask you a couple questions too, and I want to thank you very much for bringing on our webinar today. Obviously, I think this information is kind of an essential prerequisite for almost any forest activist here in the entire Chesapeake watershed. These kinds of statistics are the ones that almost everybody cites, quotes, uses, kind of cherry picks at times to show the kinds of things and trends that they want to highlight. What kind of describe a little bit about the dissemination mechanism that you've undertaken in order to get this information out about the new agreement? For many people, this data is brand new. They're not familiar with it. And frankly, many have been quite concerned about how the chaos in Washington has affected your efforts to disseminate this information or even actually to work on it because you're down to such a small staff to do so. So, tell us a little bit about the dissemination, and then I'll ask you, if you don't mind, a couple follow-up questions about the details. But I'm particularly interested in how you share it with policy leaders, not just the general public.
Well, that is a very good question. And I think, as federal employees, sometimes we have a hard time like navigating that interface with like, what sort of interaction with policy leaders is appropriate. But, I think we do really rely on our partners, especially our nonprofit partners, to kind of help us get the word out and figure out what those channels are. We have a pretty good network built up through our forestry work group at the Bay program. We have a pretty large distribution list and pretty engaged group of folks. We meet monthly, first Wednesday of every month. If anyone's interested and you're not on our list already, please let me know. Everyone's always welcome to at least listen in to those meetings. But I think at the Bay program, we really rely on our networks to be able to distribute information because we work such across such a huge watershed. But I think you speak to a good challenge in that we are capacity limited, and I think the dissemination piece is a place where sometimes we fall short. We put a lot of effort into developing new tools and shiny new things, and then kind of forget about like, okay, how do we actually make sure that people know that these tools are out there? I know this year, like we put out all these tools in September, and then we were all furloughed in October. So Like there was, some planned follow-up and then we kind of lost a little momentum and we're kind of getting back to it now, even though they're not brand new anymore. We actually just did a webinar yesterday through the Bay program on these new tools. Had really good turnout for that webinar, and are going to be talking with our strategic engagement team here at the Bay program before too much longer to get some additional input on kind of the best strategy for disseminating the information. Because yeah, I think we are a little limited in what we can do on our own, and but we have a really strong network of partners, so we just plan to leverage that as much as possible to help us get the word out.
Very good. Very good. Let me ask a couple specifics. One of the questions that continues to, well, two that I want to focus on is mitigation and loss, forest lands, particularly in light of the new agreement. Obviously, many people consider the new agreement from the conversations that we've had as kind of a lowering of the goals, so to speak. Other people characterize those changes as, quote, more realistic and less ambitious and more likely to reflect the reality of effort that's actually going on and accomplishments that have been made. What is your experience in this area? How have you handled that conversation about the differences between the earlier goals in the 2014 agreement and those in the current agreement?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, we were specifically asked to develop goals that were more realistic. And when you looked at our progress, especially for forest buffers since the 2014 agreement was signed, like we saw some good progress, which was really encouraging, but we were still so far away from that 900 mile per year target that we didn't think in good faith it made sense to maintain that as something that we thought was, achievable, at least in the short term. Maybe if there are bigger structural changes that are put in place and we kind of build up more of a workforce and like work out some of the current, bottlenecks in our ability to implement restoration at scale, that it could change in the future, but at least in, the next, 15-year time frame, we thought that it was prudent to bring things down a little bit. But I would say that, the goals we set are still really ambitious. I mean, there's really like they're on the high end of what we have ever achieved. So like I think the level of ambition was high, but we were looking to kind of get to that sweet spot where it's something that's ambitious, but also something that is possible. And I think, one of our strategies as we were kind of working up the new outcome language with our work group is that, we can talk about what's achievable, between now and 2040, still ambitious, but achievable. But we still were given space to think about what our like long-term stretch goal is. So we're not losing sight of like where we're trying to get. Because I think we didn't want people to think, okay, if we just do these things till 2040, like we're done, like we did it, watershed restored. But it's like, this is a long-term, like generational or multi-generational effort to restore the watershed. And the level of effort is like very, very high. And we're just biting off the next chunk to 2040. But we're kind of like putting our line in the sand. Like this is really where we think we need to get, like that 75% of riparian areas throughout the watershed being forested. Like we're pretty far away from that, but we think that's where we need to get to. So, I think that was kind of how we navigated that, need to be realistic and responsive to direction from our leadership while also like calling out the things that we really need to do to restore the watershed.
Excellent point. Let me just reverse that amendment from the goals that we've set to the continuing loss of forest cover in all the jurisdictions, save the District of Columbia. I noticed it was just 1 acre, so I'm not going to really focus on the district so much. They've been doing a absolutely fantastic job with the help of KC Trees and other nonprofits and stakeholders in the area to help maintain what they've got. That issue aside, for the district, however, I noticed that all the jurisdictions continue to lose forest cover. In your experience, is it, because many people think that this has not been mitigated adequately, are we finding more loss or are we actually achieving more success in mitigating the loss and slowing it down in these jurisdictions. What's your impression of forest loss in the jurisdictions?
It's a little tricky to parse out. We have like two periods of change to be able to like think about whether our rate is gaining or slowing. And
Mm,
between those two time periods, the quality of the data also changed. And so we think we're picking up gains better than we were before, with that second round of data. So it might appear that it is flattening out, but it could also just be a function of data quality issues not being consistent. So
the refinement of the measuring techniques and
yeah,
the data behind them,
exactly.
right? Okay.
Exactly. So I don't think we can really definitively say whether the rate of loss is increasing or decreasing. We know it's still a big issue, and something that we need to focus a lot on. And also, like the drivers of loss seem to be changing from what we hear. Like I think historically we focused a lot on, mitigating or minimizing losses to like residential developments, but now in some parts of the watershed, like especially Virginia, they're looking like they're clearing forests for solar developments, like on a big
Yes,
scale. And so like,
substantially.
yeah, so like the nature of the loss and like why we're losing trees is changing, and we're trying to keep pace with that so we can kind of better understand where there are opportunities to kind of step in and help local governments who are like, making a lot of those local land use planning decisions better understand what's happening and kind of the implications and potential approaches to address the loss. So I think, this one of the new outcomes that I didn't really talk about at all, but I mentioned in passing is there's this new land use planning and decision support outcome through the Bay program that's really going to be focused on that local government engagement and
I
doing
saw
that
that
kind of
was your
direct
highest
assistance.
priority in a couple areas. Uh,
Yeah, yeah. So,
I want to ask you in our time one last question on this issue that we get a lot of questions on. How do you feel the new Bay Agreement embraces environmental justice? And what would you respond to those folks who think that we need to do an even better job of focusing on those needs of underserved and ultimately greater impacted populations, particularly in urban areas?
I don't think I can answer that question because we were directed not to work on environmental justice as federal employees. So, I think that's something we're going to have to defer to the states and other partners on, unfortunately.
Okay, well,
But no value judgment. That's just how it is.
it's a fair answer.
Yep.
I don't want to corner you on this issue, but it is one of the questions that we get on our when I talk to people in the field about whether or not the agreement is
Yeah.
adequately responsive to that issue or actually ignores it. Uh,
Yeah.
Megan, that is the questions that I had. I don't plan to add anything to my previous remarks about the foundation's work in the coming uh, quarter, so to speak. I want to invite all of those who've tuned in today to join us again in February, obviously, for a webinar that many people have thought was extremely important, and we've been negotiating for a couple months trying to get it scheduled. We finally got it on the calendar and got a commitment from the vice president of the Boulder Environmental Justice Group to talk about this work so that we know what locals, particularly local organizations, can do in advocacy legally. And we'll put that in the context of their membership in a local environmental organization as an advocate for it. Uh, That'll be our principal topic in February. And obviously, we have others coming up, which we'll outline at that time. Is there anything you want to add before we close out today, Megan?
Just my thanks to you and to Katie. I will also share that the one comment we've received through the questions is just adding thanks from Fred Dickinson for the Understand Your Canopy link and all the data visibility. So he wanted to compliment the info that you provided, and I will echo that and thanking you both for your presentations today.
I want to impress upon folks the remarkable detail of the website that you shared earlier in your presentation, Catherine. Many people are not familiar with the level of detail and the broad context of the information that you shared. I thought it was just excellent. Uh, many people don't use the web as well as they could, and sometimes simply finding the link is a challenge for some. So I'm really pleased that you could highlight that. And again, I want to thank you for joining our program today. And Catherine, I just want to give you a heads up that I'm going to be inviting you back at some point in the
All
future
right.
to talk about some of the specifics of this data in a slightly more narrow context, but we'll wait for another conversation for those details. Friends, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. And Megan, if there's nothing left to say, I want to have everyone to simply say, Happy New Year to all of you, and we look forward to helping broaden your understanding and asking you to share this information broadly and join us each third Thursday in 2026 for Framing the Future, the webinar series brought to you by the Maryland Forestry Foundation. Thank you very much for joining us today. Take care, friends. Bye bye.
Thank you.